An early American author once wrote this. She said, "Lost yesterday, somewhere between sunrise and sunset, 2 golden hours. Each set was 60 diamond minutes. No reward is offered, for they are gone forever." Well, no doubt, as you recognize, and in beautiful words, she's talking about the value of time, how precious time is. And indeed, she's right that once an hour or a minute or a day is gone, it is gone forever. However, as beautiful as her words are, she did overlook one feature that shows how even more valuable time is. Well, nicely, the Bible comments on that for us. Let's see what that feature is. If you will, please find Psalm 90 and verse 10. Of course, as you know, this is a prayer of Moses. Let's see if we can identify what is the feature that she overlooked. Verse 10 says, "The span of our life is 70 years, or 80 if one is especially strong." So what our early American author failed to tell us is that our lifetime is very limited. Man's life is short-lived, just a mere hoped-for 70 or 80 years. Now, granted, if you're 10 years old, 80 sounds like a big number. But if we're 70 or 80 years old, we look back on our life and what do we say? Where did time go? And in fact, Moses said that at the end of verse 10. He says it quickly passes by. That's why we look forward to eternal life, when we won't be limited like we are currently with just 70 or 80 hoped for years. Now, it's true that Moses was talking about and praying about using time wisely. However, he mentioned something else in his prayer that we want to focus on today. So let's go back to verse 10. Notice after he mentions the lifespan, 70 or 80 years, then he says, "But they are filled with trouble and sorrow." So it is true that during those hoped for 70 or 80 years, problems and pressures and challenges will arise in our lives. So today in our discussion, we want to focus on that. We know that God's servants are not immune to the pressures of life. So how can we deal with and realistically view problems and pressures that arise in our life? How can we be successful? That's what we want to focus on. Now, we're not left to wonder, because later in Moses' prayer, he answers that question.
All right, it's all yours.
Okay. An early American author once wrote this. She said, "Lost yesterday, somewhere between sunrise and sunset, 2 golden hours. Each set was 60 diamond minutes. No reward is offered, for they are gone forever." Well, no doubt you recognize that she's talking about, and in beautiful words, the value of time, how precious time really is, just like precious gemstones. And she's right that once an hour or day has gone by, it can never be retrieved again. However, in these beautiful words, she did overlook a feature that shows how even more valuable that time is. Nicely, the Bible comments on that feature. So let's see what it is. If we could turn to Psalm 90, or find Psalm 90, verse 10. And of course, we'll recognize that this was a prayer of Moses. And notice what he says that makes the time even more valuable. It says, "The span of our life is 70 years, or 80 if one is especially strong." So what our author overlooked is that our lives are short-lived. It's only a hope for 70 or 80 years. That really shows the value of time. Now, granted, if we're 10 years old, 80 sounds like a big number. But if we've lived our life to that amount of time, 70 or 80 years, and we look back on that time, we say, where did it go? It went by so quickly. And interestingly, at the end of verse 10, you'll notice that's what Moses said. That's what he prayed. It says, it just quickly passes by. And that's why we look forward to eternal life, when we won't be limited by this hope for 70 or 80 years. Now, it is true that Moses is praying about the value of time and how he can use it wisely. But interestingly, in verse 10, he mentions something else in his prayer, and in fact, that's what we want to focus on today. So let's go back to verse 10. So after he mentions the 70 or 80 years, notice what he goes on to say. But they are filled with trouble and sorrow. Isn't it true that during this 70 or 80 years, we have troubles? There are sorrows. There are pressures and problems and challenges that arise. So the question is, as God's servants, how can we deal with those challenges successfully? Well, we're not left to wonder because Moses answers that question. Let's continue on. Continue on in his beautiful prayer. Look at verse 12. He says, teach us how to count our days so that we may acquire a heart of wisdom. Now, again, focusing on the value of time, he wants to count his days wisely. And of course, he asked Jehovah for help to do that. But wouldn't it also be helpful in dealing with these challenges or problems or pressures that arise in our life? For example, let's break it down because this is our theme. We know what it means to acquire. It means to obtain something, to get something. And in our theme, you see the word acquiring, which means it's ongoing. But what about our heart? What heart was Moses talking about? Well, obviously we know it's our figurative heart. It's the person that we are inside. It's the inner person. It's our emotions, our motivations, our thoughts, and our desires. What about wisdom? Well, wisdom is the application of knowledge. But what knowledge was Moses talking about? Well, who was Moses praying to? He was praying to Jehovah God. So he was asking for godly knowledge and then the wisdom to be able to apply that in his life. Now, if we wanted to put that in very simple terms, we could say that Moses was praying to Jehovah and asking, Jehovah, help me to be more like you. Help me to think like you. Help me to view things like you do, with godly wisdom or a heart of wisdom. Now, it wasn't for no reason that Moses was praying this. Moses realized that from time to time in his life, he did not handle matters with a heart of wisdom. For example, with what happened in Meribah the second time. Once again, the Israelites are complaining about not having enough water. And frankly, Moses, he had it, as if it was his fault. And so the account says that his emotions became enraged. And then what did he do? Well, he didn't handle it with a heart of wisdom. He acted out rashly and presumptuously. And of course, he paid dearly for those rash actions. Now, had he shown a heart of wisdom, remember we said that the heart involved our emotions. And so if he would have kept his emotions, in check, then he would have handled that much more wisely, as Jehovah had commanded him to do. And of course, the outcome would have been much better. So a nice point that we can stop and reflect on here is that if we handle matters with a heart of wisdom, godly wisdom, then it'll always turn out well. And Jehovah will always give us his blessing. We learn something else, though, from this account. Where did the pressure come from that caused Moses to act the way that he did? Was it from the outside? No, it wasn't from the outside. It was from the inside, wasn't it? It was an internal pressure from his fellow brothers and sisters, his fellow Israelites. So why do we mention that? We recognize that we're going to have pressures and problems from the outside. But sometimes when the pressure or the problem is internal, say maybe from the congregation or our family, we have a much harder time showing a heart of wisdom. And so, dear friends, that's what we want to focus on today. How can we deal successfully with these internal pressures and problems? God's servants throughout the ages have had to deal with internal problems. For example, from a faithful man Abel all the way up to modern times, there's been internal problems within the congregation or within our families. We might take, for example, the Israelites. They had to deal with many, many wicked kings. And if for a moment we could slip our feet into the Israelite sandals, can you imagine what it was like living under the reign of a wicked king, a king that had lost to Jehovah's favor? Not only would that affect the king, but it would also affect you as well. We can think of an example of King Saul. Now we know that King Saul started out to be a good king, but then he became a very wicked king. Again, imagine watching this transpire and then feeling the effects of Saul losing Jehovah's spirit. Now David was a good example. He lived during that time period. Why do we say that David was a good example? David used a heart of wisdom. For instance, when Saul tried to kill David by thrusting a spear at him, of course we know David was able to be fleet of foot and the spear missed. He didn't pull it back out of the wall and throw it back at Saul trying to kill him. Why? Because he had a heart of wisdom. We have a real life example of that in 1 Samuel chapter 24. And we'll just relate the account to you. Once again, David was on the run with his men, and Saul was chasing him, trying to kill him. One day they were back in the recesses of a cave, and Saul didn't know that, and he entered the cave. Now, notice in verse 4, 1 Samuel 24 and verse 4, what David's men said to him. They said, "This is the day Jehovah is saying to you, look, I'm giving your enemy into your hand." Was that the case? Was Jehovah giving Saul into David's hand? From the outside appearances, it appeared that was the case. What would David do? Would he use a heart of wisdom in this matter? Well, partially he did. He did not execute King Saul, but rather he just cut off the edges of Saul's sleeveless coat. After doing that, though, in verse 5, it said he began to feel very, very bad. Why? Because he recognized that he was using human wisdom and not godly wisdom. He wasn't viewing it from God's standpoint. How do we know that's the case? Or that was his thinking. Verse 6, this is what he said. He goes, "It is unthinkable from Jehovah's standpoint that I should do such a thing to the anointed of Jehovah." David recognized that he did not have the authority, nor was he directed to execute King Saul. Only Jehovah had that authority. Now let's reflect back on Moses, what happened with him. He presumptuously assumed Jehovah's authority when he took credit for bringing the water out of that crag. David was not going to do that. He was not going to presumptuously assume Jehovah's authority. Do you see how having a heart of wisdom helped him to avert a disastrous outcome? So we learn another nice point, that if we show a heart of wisdom, we have blessings. If we don't show a heart of wisdom, then the results will always be disastrous. So what a nice example that David was in acquiring a heart of wisdom. Let's talk about the first century Christian congregation. Were those almost perfect congregations with no internal problems or pressures? Well, let's find out. Let's turn our Bibles, or find in our Bibles, please, Revelation chapter 2. So in Revelation chapter 2, and we'll just start with verse 1. We're going to talk about one of the first century Christian congregations, and that was the congregation that was in Ephesus, in the Ephesians. Verse 2 says it. Now notice this description, and this is Jesus describing them. He says, "I know your deeds and your labor and endurance, and that you cannot tolerate bad men, and that you put to the test those who say they are apostles, but they are not, and you and you found them to be liars. You are also showing endurance, and you have persevered for the sake of my name, and have not grown weary. My, what a description. Isn't that beautiful? Would you like to be a part of that congregation? You'd say, well, it's almost perfect. It doesn't sound like they have any problems. And, well, maybe that's what we would expect from a congregation that was made up of entirely anointed Christians. But then there's verse 4. Notice what Jesus says. Nevertheless, I hold this against you, that you have left the love you had at first. So no, not a perfect congregation. In fact, Jesus said you have a very serious internal problem. So serious, he said that if you don't fix it, he says, I'm going to come and take away your congregation. The same was true if you turn over to verses 12 and 13. This is Pergamum. Again, gets just a glowing recommendation. But then verses 14 and 15, Jesus says, you have two very serious internal problems. You're holding on to wrong teachings and beginning to promote sectarianism. The same, look down at verse 20, Thyatira. Same thing. A nice commendation, but then you have a very serious internal problem. You're allowing this Jezebel-like influence to prevail in the congregation. So even in the first century congregations, they too had internal problems and internal pressures that they would have to deal with. So why do we mention that? Why do we give these examples? It's because we can't expect perfection from Jehovah's servants yet. We're not there yet. The members of the congregation were all imperfect. Mistakes will be made. Things will be said that shouldn't be said. Things that will be done that shouldn't be done. How do we deal with it? How do we not get discouraged and lose our joy in serving Jehovah, or even worse, our trust in Jehovah's arrangement? It's by acquiring a heart of wisdom, having godly wisdom. Now let's illustrate that. Look at a congregation in the first century that had a serious internal problem, but by using godly wisdom, a heart of wisdom, it turned out very successful. You'll find that in Acts 15. So if we can find that, please. Acts 15, and we'll start right with verse 1. And you'll recognize the issue. So verse 15 says, now some men came down from Judea and began to teach the brothers, unless you get circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So it was the issue of circumcision. Now again, if we put ourselves in those congregations, they were diverse congregations made up of Jewish Christians as well as Gentile Christians. Now for the Jewish Christians, circumcision was probably still being practiced, but not for the Gentile Christians. Can you imagine, if you are a Gentile Christian, the internal pressure that would arise from that? In other words, you might think in your mind, well, wait a minute, I'm dedicated, I'm baptized and anointed. That's not enough. I now have to be circumcised. So how would this internal pressure problem be handled with a heart of wisdom? Well, let's continue on. Let's look at verse 2. It says, but after quite a bit of discussion and dissensions and disputing by Paul and Barnabas with them, it was arranged for Paul, Barnabas, and some of the others to go up to the apostles and elders in Jerusalem regarding this issue. Do you see how the local elders, local brothers, were going to handle that with a heart of wisdom? They weren't going to presumptuously assume that they could make the decision whether it was necessary or not. They knew Jehovah's arrangement, and that would be a decision that would need to come from the governing body there in the first century. What a nice example of showing a heart of wisdom. If you can imagine, if each congregation would have decided on their own on this issue, there would have been quite a division. One congregation would have said, yes, it is necessary. One congregation would have said, no, it's not necessary. So now the matter's with the governing body. Now, how would they show a heart of wisdom in making this decision, godly wisdom? Well, notice in verse 7, it says, and to be a fly on the wall during this meeting, after much intense discussion had taken place. Intense discussion. It said much intense discussion. So what do we see happening here? Well, no doubt, perhaps their emotions were getting involved. Opinions and feelings, background and culture may have entered into this discussion. Is that showing a heart of wisdom? No, not yet. So how would they show a heart of wisdom? Well, notice you'll see next that Peter rose and he began to address the governing body. And he began to relate all the things that God had done with and for the Gentile Christians. And he even made the recommendation not to place an extra burden on these faithful brothers and sisters. So look at verse 12, what happens. The whole demeanor of the room changes. It says, at that, the entire group became silent. What does that mean? So now you can see how the brothers are thinking. It's not about how I feel about this or my opinion or my emotions, but now it's about what does God think? How does he feel? And in fact, in Peter's address, he uses the title God 4 times. So now a heart of wisdom is entering in. Now they want to know, what is God's view of this matter of circumcision? Well, how would they find out? They turn to God's word. And James, the Apostle James, began to relate a prophecy that applied to the very decision that they were needing to make. Now, how was James able to do that? Verse 28 says, Holy Spirit. So at that point, Jehovah gave them his Holy Spirit that became a remembrancer so that they could recall the prophecy, as well as a teacher so they could understand its application to the decision that God wanted them to make. Beautifully, after all of this happened, they came to a unanimous decision. And what was the result? Verse 31, it says, after reading the decision in the congregations, it says, they rejoiced over the encouragement. Remember what we said, showing a heart of wisdom always brings blessings. What a blessing that was to the congregations, to preserve their unity, and now they would conduct themselves as God wanted them to. They had Jehovah's thinking. They were acquiring a heart of wisdom. Now, this happened in 49 CE, this decision. And sometimes, and I feel this way too, that we kind of leave this issue of circumcision here, that we might have felt that the congregations lived peacefully ever after, and they were now united on this matter of circumcision. But in actuality, that wasn't necessarily true. In Galatians chapter 5, and in verse 2, Paul had to once again address this matter of circumcision. This is around 51 to 52 CE, so we're talking about 2 or 3 years later. Here's what Paul said. He said, I, Paul, am telling you that if you become circumcised, Christ will be of no benefit to you. So evidently, some in the congregation were still holding on to that wrong idea that circumcision was needed for salvation. Now, why do we mention that? Because if you are in that congregation, you might think, well, this was made 3 years ago, or at least 2 years ago. Everybody made the decision. Why does this problem continue to exist? Well, in 55 CE, now we're 6 years later, in the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul said this, 1 Corinthians 7:19. He says, circumcision means nothing. He says, what means something is the observing of God's commands. So 6 years later, this internal problem, pressure, is still existing. Would you have gotten discouraged, lost your joy, and maybe even your trust in Jehovah's organization or his arrangements? Not if we showed a heart of wisdom. Now, what do we mean? See, we could look at this situation, and we could say, well, why does Jehovah allow this problem to continue? Or we could look at it and say, what am I learning to be a better Christian? For example, am I learning more patience with Jehovah's patience? How about more humility, more love for my brothers, loyalty to Jehovah's organization and to Jehovah himself, and even dependency on Jehovah. See, acquiring the heart of wisdom would help you to deal with this internal problem as we patiently waited for Jehovah to handle it. Now, interesting, in 61 CE, now we're talking almost 12 years later, problems still exist. In Philippians, Paul had to address this problem a little more forcefully this time. And in Titus chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, it alludes to the fact that some of those might have been disfellowshipped because they would not give up that wrong teaching or that wrong idea in order to safeguard the congregation. So if you were in those congregations for those entire 12 years, acquiring a heart of wisdom would have helped you deal with that internal pressure and that internal problem. Well, friends, the same is true today. We're going to have pressures and problems internally in our congregations, or perhaps maybe in our families as well. And as we've looked at these nice examples, acquiring a heart of wisdom is what's going to help us to be successful. So for just the last few minutes, we want to talk about, well, then how do we acquire a heart of wisdom? Three things that we just like to mention briefly. The first one, of course, obviously, just as in the first century, how do they find out what was God's thinking on this matter of circumcision? They went to the scriptures. And it is true, if we want to get God's mind, then we have to read his words. We have to meditate on them. We have to apply them. And as we do that more and more, we gather Jehovah's thinking. Any matter in our life, any decision in our life, we go to the scriptures to learn, how does Jehovah think on this matter? What would he like me to do on this occasion? We're acquiring a heart of wisdom from the Bible. Nicely, too, today we have the faithful and discreet slave that help us to understand the scriptures more clearly and help us to and help guide our lives through suggestions, direction, and counsel. Now go back to the first century governing body. Beautifully, the ones in the congregation who were acquiring a heart of wisdom, they were obedient to the direction that the governing body gave them. Well, the same is true today. We show godly wisdom when we're obedient to the faithful and discreet slave. The third area is just being realistic about our congregations, even being realistic about our elders in the congregation. As we mentioned already, no one's perfect yet in the Christian congregation. So we will expect that there will be mistakes will be made. There will be personality flaws. There's imperfection. If we have godly wisdom, we don't look at our brothers in a negative way, at the mistakes that they might make, but we look at them the way Jehovah sees them. Why does Jehovah love them? That's why I should love them. Why did Jehovah draw this individual into the organization? That's how I want to view my brother and my sister. And by doing it that way, then we don't become discouraged and lose our joy, or as we mentioned, even worse, our trust in Jehovah's organization. So in those three ways, we can acquire a heart of wisdom. Student of the Bible, be obedient to the direction of the faithful and discreet slave, and then third, be realistic in viewing our brothers and sisters. Jehovah's servants have never claimed to be infallible. They don't claim to be inspired prophets. And so from time to time, as we mentioned, there might be mistakes that are made, even in the congregation. And from time to time, there will be adjustments in our understanding of the scriptures. But if we show a heart of wisdom, we'll recognize that's prophetic. Proverbs 4:18, the light will get brighter and brighter in these last days. Perhaps maybe then we could just use an illustration that would help us to understand being realistic about our brothers and sisters in the congregation. Let's say that you're going to take a little trip and you're going to come out west and you want to see our beautiful Rocky Mountains when we can travel. And so you decide that your route's going to be I-70, and so you're traveling out through on I-70 heading west, and you enter into eastern Colorado, and it's true, if you've made this trip, that you can begin to see those beautiful mountains more than 100 miles away. Now, granted, they're not very big, but you can see those snow-capped peaks. And if it's in the spring and the prairies are green and you got the white snow of the mountains, it is like nothing you've ever seen. You might say that's the perfect scene. But what happens as you get closer and closer and closer to those mountains? Well, you start to see more of the details. It's not just the snow-capped peaks anymore. And the Rocky Mountains can be pretty rugged. And sadly, in the summer, we get wildfires and you'll start to see burn scars. And none of that's really very pretty. So you might start wondering, you say, okay, what happened to those beautiful snow-capped peaks that I saw 100 miles ago? They didn't go anywhere. They're still there. But now that you're so close to the mountains, if you want to see the peaks, you have to look up. And the closer you get, the more you have to look up. The same is true with the congregation. From a distance, it looks beautiful. Nothing you've ever seen before. It's perfect. And it is beautiful. But as you get closer and closer to the congregation, what do you start to see? Well, you start to see personality flaws, mistakes, imperfections. You might wonder in your mind, what happened to those beautiful snow-capped peaks? They're still there. But you know what you need to do. You need to look up. And the closer you get to the congregation, the more you need to look up. And who are you looking up to? We're looking up to Jehovah God. And in an honest, sincere, humble prayer, just like Moses in Psalm 90, verse 12, we're asking Jehovah, please, please, Jehovah, help me to keep on acquiring a heart of wisdom.